Well, good morning again, Hill Country. It is so good to be with you. And again, if you're joining us online, it's so great to have you with us today. If you're in person, it's good to see your smiling faces. And in order for us to get started well today, I need to ask you a question, okay? Can I ask you a question? It's simply this, have you ever done or said something that made sense to you, but not to those around you? You ever done that? Have you ever done or said something that made sense to you, but not to those around you? Husbands, I want to talk to you for a moment. Do you remember that time your wife asked you to go to the grocery store, and she said, I just want you to get that one thing, and you go into the grocery store, and you see a whole world of possibilities. And you come home with like 5, maybe 10 different things, and you come in the house, and you're like really proud because you found all that stuff that you needed. And she's like what? Why did you get all that stuff? And you're like, I know, it's great, right? Like, we needed that. And she's like, no, I wanted you to get that one thing. Like, right, that made sense to you, but maybe not to her. Or, wives, let me talk to you for a moment. Do you remember that one time your husband, like, you knew what he was trying to do, but like he was trying to be really clear about what time you needed to leave for the party? And he thought he was clear, but in your mind, you viewed that more of a suggestion or like a good idea. And like you're like, yeah, I know what time you're saying, but as long as it's like around there sometime, like it was clear to him and it made sense to him, but to you, it was like, yeah, we'll just say whatever. You know what I'm talking about? Or dads, have you ever had this happen before? Like your wife has to go away for the evening and you're the one that's solely responsible for getting the kids to bed. And your wife gets home later that night and says, well, how'd it go? And you said, it was great. And she says, really? Well, what did you do? And you say, like, well, I put him to bed. Well, and she's like, no, but like, how did you do it? And he's like, what? I just told him to go to bed. And she's like, no, like, did you have them brush their teeth? Did you have them put on their pajamas? Like, did you, like, read them a story? Did you sing to them? And you look back, you're like, no, I didn't do any of those things. I just said go to bed and they went to bed. Like that made sense to you, right? You know what I'm talking about? That made sense to you and maybe not so much to her. Have you ever been there before? Like when you've said or done something that makes sense to you but maybe not to those around you? When Jackie and I first started dating, we were living in South Carolina at the time, and we had this great idea that we were going to go skiing. And if you know anything about South Carolina, there's no place to go skiing. But there's some small hills, what we would call small hills, up in North Carolina that you can kind of sled down some snow in. And so we were going to go up to North Carolina to go skiing, so we had to get up early in the morning. And I said, hey, we'll just get breakfast on the way. And you were like, okay, that's a good idea. Now, I didn't realize this at the time, but her idea of breakfast and my idea of breakfast were very different things. So in her mind, she thought that stopping to get breakfast meant stopping in a cute little mountain town where they had good coffee, where we could spend some time talking for a while before we went to go skiing. So to her surprise, when we pulled into a gas station to fill up, and I said, hey, let's go grab a coffee and a prepackaged pastry. And she said, for what? And I said, for breakfast. Like that made sense to me, but it didn't make sense to her at all. Come on, have you ever done that before? Where you've said something or done something that makes sense to you, but maybe not so much to those around you? Well, if you've been tracking with us at all through our 2 Corinthians series, Paradox, as we've been looking at this, one of the things that we've seen often happen with Paul is he'll say something or do something that makes complete sense to him, but to the church in Corinth or to the Corinthian culture, it doesn't make sense at all. And in fact, if you were with us last week, Paul said something that was so countercultural that it must have left them puzzled. Do you remember what he said? It was 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 30. Paul says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Now, Paul boasting in his weakness would have sounded absolutely ridiculous to the Corinthians. And it would have sounded ridiculous because they had been so heavily influenced not only by their culture, but this other group of guys that we've called, or Paul has called, the super apostles. And if you remember anything about the super apostles, they came in trying to display their strength. They had an image to protect. They were trying to talk about their accomplishments and what they had done for the church. And really for them, what life was all about was making a name for themselves rather than for Jesus. And if you remember, Paul saw right through their scheming. He knew exactly what they were doing. And last week, we saw him start to press up against that. You saw him start to push back, saying, guys, this is all about you and what you're doing, but I want to show you something a little bit different. I actually want to show you another way. And the point that we ended on last week was simply this, that Paul showed us that embracing your weakness is actually the pathway to experiencing God's power. Embracing your weakness is actually the pathway to experiencing God's power. And that's where we're going to pick back up today. And I want us to look at this, and I want to ask Paul a question. If Paul were in the room today, this is the question that I'd want to ask him. I would want to say, Paul, how? How did you do this? How did you learn to embrace your weakness so that you were actually able to experience God's power? Like, how did you do this? Because I don't know about you, but if that's possible, I want to experience God's power like Paul talked about. Then maybe you're joining us online or you're here today and maybe you wouldn't identify yourself as a Christian or even a Jesus follower. You're just kind of curious. You're not sure where you're at, and that's great because I just want you to know this, that if that's you, there's going to be an invitation for you today. Paul's going to unpack something that I want you to see today, that in the midst of some of your questioning and maybe even in the midst of some of your confusion, I want you to lean in, if that's you. Now, maybe you've been walking with Jesus for years, or maybe just a little bit of time. Whatever it may be, I want you to know that Paul has something that he wants to show us today. And I'm not being overly dramatic, but Paul's going to say something today to the church in Corinth that relates to us, that if we would listen to it, and not just listen to it, but put it into practice, it literally has the power to transform our lives. And so I don't know about you, but I want to experience this power that he's talking about by embracing weakness. I want to see what this is all about. Because if I'm honest, I don't need more of my strength in my life. I need more of his. I don't need more of my wisdom in life. I need more of his wisdom. How about you? So if that's you, I want to invite you to go ahead and turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're going to start in verse 1. And as we open up this passage, I want to invite you to look at it for yourself. If you have it in a paper copy or a digital copy, go ahead and open it up. Look at the words. Read along as we go. They're going to be up on the screen, but there's just something special about being able to look at it for yourself. And I want us to ask this question of Paul. How did you do this? Paul, how did you do this? So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 1, Paul says this. I must go on boasting, though there's nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Now pause there for a moment because we've got to remember the context. You see, Paul says he's going to go on boasting, and if you remember anything from last week, you'll remember this, is that he was speaking to the church in Corinth in a very specific way because they had become so accustomed to the culture around them, as well as the super apostles, who their way of communicating was to boast and to brag about their accomplishments and their strength. And so Paul is saying, I'm going to continue boasting, I'm going to keep talking in a way that you understand, but you need to remember that me boasting is actually me being a fool. I'm going to talk like the super apostles. I'm going to talk like the rest of the culture talks, but me talking like that is actually talking like a madman. So what's about ready to come out of my mouth, you need to remember that my boasting is how a fool would boast. You got the context? So here's what he goes on to say in verse 2. He says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, or I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it. so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. What? What are you talking about, Paul? Doesn't this sound kind of weird? Like, you ever have that happen before where someone's trying to say something and you just want to say, like, what are you talking about? Sometimes I feel like that with Paul, and it's kind of one in these moments where it's like, Paul, why are you talking so weird? But Paul's going to show us why. There's a purpose behind why Paul's talking the way in which he is. Paul actually is talking about himself. And it sounds kind of weird that he's talking about himself, even though he says earlier in the passage, I know a man. And he knows a man, but then he says 2 verses later, in verse 7, to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh. So Paul is actually talking about himself. He is the one who had this extraordinary experience where he's called up into paradise. But here's the amazing thing, is that Paul has this stunning experience, only to kind of give it this awkward, passing by kind of boast comment. I mean, imagine this for a moment. Imagine that you had kind of an out-of-body experience. Maybe somehow you died, and in the midst of this death that you had come out of your body and you'd gone to heaven and you'd had this moment where you were out of body, but then you came back into your body. I mean, what do you think you would do with that? You'd probably tell a whole bunch of people, right? Not only would you tell a whole bunch of people, you'd probably write a book about it. And then you'd go on a speaking tour about it. And then you'd make a whole bunch of money off of your experience. And what you would do is you'd use your experience off of your heavenly experience to then authorize your views of what you think heaven is like. I don't know if you would do that, but maybe, because that's normally what we like to do with our experiences, is we like to tell people about them. You see, most of us would be consumed with telling other people about it. But that's not what Paul's doing here. In fact, he only mentions it this one time in all 13 of his letters. And he never talks about it in such a way to leverage his extraordinary experience to get people to believe in what he's saying. In fact, the only reason that he brings up this extraordinary experience here is precisely to show how not to boast. Do you get this? He's bringing it up to say, don't boast like this. This is what a fool sounds like. Rather, Paul wants to boast in his weaknesses rather than his extraordinary experiences. I love how John Piper says it. He says, because it is merely human to boast about extraordinary experiences like visions and out-of-body encounters with God. It requires no great grace or power of God to boast in things that seem to set you apart as privileged. So here's what Paul's doing. He's embracing his weakness. Remember, that's the question we're asking. Paul, how did you embrace this weakness in order to experience God's power? Paul's embracing his weakness by boasting in weakness over extraordinary experiences. He's saying, I'm not going to boast about what I've been through in terms of these incredible supernatural experiences, but I'm going to boast about where I'm weak. See, Paul wasn't trying to set himself apart as privileged, but Paul was taking the form of a servant so that more and more people could know the power and the love of Jesus. Paul didn't want to be on display. He wanted Jesus to be on display. Wouldn't it be great if that was our heart's pure desire? If it was about magnifying Jesus and putting Jesus on display? But if we're honest, don't we all have a tendency to flip the script on that? That sometimes, at the core level, we want to be noticed. We want to be acclaimed. We want a platform. We want more social media followers. Or maybe we flip it in this way, and maybe it's not just that, but maybe you serve behind the scenes, but really what you want is you want to be noticed for what you're doing behind the scenes. And so there it is. There's that desire deep inside. You see, every single one of us since the beginning of time when sin entered this world all have a propensity towards pride. And pride has a sneaky way of poking up its ugly head in all different areas of our lives. And you know what? You're not immune to it. and I'm not immune to it. And Paul is not immune to it. I mean, look at what he says next in verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Now, there's been speculation over the last 2,000 years as to what this thorn in the flesh was, what this messenger of Satan was. People have wanted to know specifically, Paul, what was it? Why don't you just spell it out? Now, to be clear, here's what it was not. It was not a specific sin. Paul's not talking about his struggle with lust. He's not talking about a struggle with anger. That's not what his weakness or thorn in the flesh is. And we see that because of what he says later in terms of what he experienced. He experienced insults, hardships. He faced persecutions. He endured calamities. He went through all of these things. So again, it's not a specific sin that he's giving into, but it's the circumstances of life that he finds himself in that are incredibly difficult, hard, and painful. And we know they're hard and painful because of the metaphor that he uses. It's a thorn in the flesh. If you've ever had a thorn in the flesh, you know how bad it hurts, how nagging it is, how painful, how annoying. Do you have anything in your life like that right now? Do you have a thorn in your flesh? Do you have an area in your life right now that you just wish weren't there? Where you just wish so badly it would be taken away? That if you could just get over it, get past it, get through it, like if it could just be removed, you could get back to experiencing life as normal, or you could start enjoying life again. But there's that thing, and you know what it is, but it's nagging you. It's painful. It's annoying. Maybe even it's embarrassing. You know what it is? Is it physical for you? Do you have a physical disability or a limitation that if you could just get past it? Maybe it's a disease or a defect, something that's going on in your life that you would just say, man, I wish my body could be the way God wanted it to be, or that's what you think. If I could just get past this, then you'd be more useful. If I could just get past this, then God could use me in ways. I wouldn't have to be such a liability to other people. If I could just get past this. Do you have a physical thorn? Or maybe for you it's mental or emotional. Maybe for you you're saying, if my mind would just stop spinning and spinning and spinning, if I could just have a concentrated thought, then I wouldn't be so anxious. I wouldn't be depressed. If I could just get rid of this anxiousness, I wish I could just snap a finger and this depression would be gone. And if it could be gone, I wouldn't be so miserable, and I wouldn't have all these defects, and I could just be happy again in life. And you wish it wasn't there, but it's there. Or maybe for you, it's in the place where you work and you look at your intelligence level, and honestly, the people that you run with and the people that you work with, you think to yourself, man, if I could just comprehend the complexities of life like the people I work with could, if I could understand how to map things, how to work things, how to be intelligent in such a way where I could actually have influence and impact on their life, but you know that there is a lid on your intelligence in terms of it doesn't matter how many books you read, how many podcasts you listen to, you just can't seem to understand life in the way other people can. And you think to yourself, God, if I could just get this, if I could just get past some of these limitations, then I could be used. Or maybe for you it's relational. You've lost someone that you love. And it's not that you just want to get over that person because you love that person, but the pain of losing that person just seems to be crippling, and you can't get on with your life. And it's hard. And you're just crying out to God, like, God, would you just help me move on? And you can't. Or maybe it's a broken relationship that hasn't been restored and maybe will never be restored, and you can't get it out of the back of your head, and it's messing with you throughout the day. Or maybe it's someone you work with. And you see them in the hallway and you want to do everything to just run in the opposite direction, and you think to yourself, like, man, if I could just get this person out of my life, like, life would be so much better. Maybe it's someone in your small group. And you know when you go to small group, you know the interaction that's going to be there, and you think to yourself, man, I wish they didn't come tonight. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe it's a family member. And you just don't want to be around them because you know the mood that it puts you in, and you're wondering, like, God, like, would you just do something about this? And when you experience that kind of pain, that kind of agony, that kind of dull, ongoing thorn in your flesh, it can be all-consuming, can't it? Where you can't think about anything else. You're in that dark valley, and you can't see anything except the difficulty and the pain that you're in. Now, I've got to imagine that that was the case for Paul at some level. But in the middle of his pain, at some point during this journey, he's able to get out from underneath the weeds and see from a different vantage point. He's able to have a different perspective to the pain that he's walking through. Look back at what he says in verse 7. He says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. So you see, whatever Paul's thorn was, he saw it as a messenger from Satan because Paul knows Satan's tactics. You see, Paul knows that Satan loves to kill, steal, and destroy because that's what Satan does. But don't miss this, because Satan was not the only one at work here, so was God. Did you see it 2 different times in this sentence? Paul tells us what he's learned about the purpose of his pain, his weakness, his thorn. He's able to see why the thorn is there. Did you see it? He said it 2 times. To keep me from becoming conceited. You see, Satan's tactic is always, always to produce pride, not to prevent it. That's how he kills. You see, the enemy had evil intentions for Paul, but God is at work in the midst of Satan's evil intentions. God has a holy intention for Paul to prevent and to protect Paul from becoming prideful. And they're working side by side. Satan wanted to make Paul miserable, but God wanted to make Paul humble and to turn him away from pride. So God allowed the thorn of Satan to be a sanctifying work in Paul's life. And Paul learned something so powerful. Paul learned to embrace his weakness by receiving weakness as God's protective power in his life. Don't miss this. Paul learned to receive weakness as God's protective power in his life. And just because Paul received it doesn't mean he liked it. Just because Paul embraced it does not mean that he was like good with it. Like, yeah, all's good. Like, now I see the big picture. It doesn't mean that at all. I mean, look at what he says down in verse 8. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. You see, Paul's desperate for God to take it away. He's pleading with the Lord, like, take it away, take it away. In Luke chapter 8, there's this story of a man named Jairus. And Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue. And it says in the story that his 12-year-old daughter was sick and that she was dying. And so Jairus, not knowing what else to do, knows that Jesus has been healing people, and he runs to find Jesus. And the way the story goes is that Jairus falls at Jesus' feet. And it says he pleaded with Jesus. He begged Jesus to heal his daughter. And you can imagine, if you've ever had a child that's sick on the verge of death, and you think that there's a possibility that someone could heal them, the type of soul-wrenching, agonizing pleading that you would be doing. And the same word that's used for what Jairus was doing with Jesus is the same word that Paul uses here with God. Paul pleaded, he begged God to take it away. He's saying, please, God, would you please take this thorn away? Now, we can't miss what Paul's doing here because it might seem obvious, but it's not natural. Look at what Paul's doing. Paul is embracing his weakness by taking his weakness to God. He's embracing his weakness by taking his weakness to God. He's crying out, God, I need you. I can't do this without you. God, would you help me? And I say this is obvious but not natural because in our own brokenness, do you know what we do when we experience pain and difficulty and discomfort? Typically, the lens through which we look is, how am I going to solve this problem? And you know this is true. You look at the problem, you look at the pain, and you say, how am I not just going to get through this, but how am I going to actually solve this, rather than the lens through which Paul is looking through here. You see, we look at our weakness, our disability, our disease, and our defect, and we look at it as a problem that needs to be solved rather than an invitation to come to the loving arms of Jesus. See, we have a different perspective. Look at what the writer of Hebrews says. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. You see, God the Father is saying, come to me. In your brokenness, in your weakness, in your struggle, come to me to find grace and to find mercy. And did you see what the word said there? It said that he sympathizes. That word sympathize means as a co-sufferer. You see, whatever you're going through right now, whatever thorn you're facing, I want you to know this, that God feels your pain. He doesn't just sit off as a bystander saying, that stinks. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, come and talk to me about it. No. He's saying, when you hurt, I hurt. When you're in agony, I'm in agony. I love you like a father loves his child because I am the most pure father you've ever known. And I love you in a way that you've never known love before. And so come to me to find grace and mercy in your time of need. And there may be some of you here right now watching online that you need to come to him because he's been asking you, he's been imploring you, he's been calling you for a long time. And you don't need to put up a front. You don't need to use any special language. If anything, the Psalms give us a great window into how God invites us to come. God invites us to come in our rawest forms. He says, come to me with the blinders off. Come to me naked. Come to me in all of your junk and all of your mess, and you don't have to make it look pretty. You don't have to pretend to be something you're not. Just come to me to find grace. Come to me and be authentically real and don't hold back. You know, God is big enough to handle your junk. I hope you know that. God is powerful enough and loving enough to handle what you may think is disgusting or what you may be embarrassed about. Because God knows every detail about your life and he loves you, he pursues you, he comes after you. That's his heart for you. But you've got to know that God will respond. God will respond to your pleading, to your begging. He will respond, but you've got to remember this, is that he will always respond according to his timetable. And he will respond according to his will. And he'll do it in such a way for your good, but also for his glory. And you can't miss that. Because we always want it done according to our timetable and according to our will. But God has a much better will, and he has a much better timeline involved with answering our prayers. Now look at how God responds to Paul's request, Paul's pleading. It says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What? God said no? How dare he? Paul, I thought you were invited to the throne of grace to receive mercy and find help in your time of need. Like, God, what are you doing? Why would you respond like that? I thought Paul was coming with this pure, great request. God, why would you do that? You ever feel like that sometimes when God doesn't respond the way that you want him to? Like, God, why are you not answering me the way that I want or not according to the timetable that I want? And do you know what the answer to that is? It's grace. Grace. God is actually giving Paul his grace. He's inviting Paul to experience his power by receiving his weakness as a gift of God's grace. Now, what does that look like? In Mark chapter 4, Jesus has just gotten through a really intense time of ministry. And he takes his disciples down to a boat, and they're going to go across the sea. And Jesus is so exhausted, he's so tired, that he's actually in the boat, sleeping, a pillow in the boat. He's asleep in the back of the boat. And as they're going across the sea, this big storm comes upon the disciples in the boat. And it's so big that the wind and the waves are so powerful that the waves are crashing in the boat. The disciples are freaking out. They think they're going to die. It seems like the boat's beginning to sink, and they're crying out to Jesus. Finally, one of the disciples, probably Peter, runs back to the back of the boat. He's like, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. He says, do you even care? I mean, that's typically what we would do, like when we're wondering what Jesus is up to, right? Like that's what we would say. Like, do you even care that we're going to die? And I love that because it's real, it's authentic, right? That's the way we feel when we're in the middle of a storm, when we're in the middle of a thorn in the flesh, when we're in the middle of experiencing our weakness. That's our question, right? God, do you even care? And it says that Jesus gets up, he looks out at the storm, and he says, peace, be still. And immediately, it's calm. Can you imagine? Can you imagine this moment? And then he looks back at the disciples and he says, why are you so afraid? Do you still not have faith? Can you imagine this moment? And the disciples look at one another kind of dumbfounded, and they have this response. They say, who is this? That even the wind and the waves obey his voice. Now, I don't want you to miss this moment because there's a connection here. You see, Jesus was not surprised by that storm that just happened. In fact, he is the creator of the storm. And he allowed his disciples to enter into this incredibly uncomfortable moment where they think their lives are over. But did you see what happened? They finally get to a place in their life where they say, oh my word. We've never seen anything like this before. Who is this that even commands the wind and the waves? You see, Jesus invited them into this place, and it's grace because even though they're uncomfortable, they are now able to see Jesus in a way that they had never seen him before. It's grace because now they know who he really is. And in fact, God does the exact same thing with us sometimes. Sometimes he invites us into these uncomfortable places, these uncomfortable circumstances. And he does it because he wants you to be in the middle of it so that you can see how great and powerful he is. And it's grace because in those moments, and it's in those moments where you really begin to see that there's nobody like Jesus. And sometimes you have to go through the storm. Sometimes you have to experience the thorn in the flesh so that you can really see more of who God is. You see, God in his grace allows weakness so that his power can be perfected. Now let me ask you a question. Is it possible that you're walking through a storm right now? That you have a thorn in your flesh. You're experiencing weakness, maybe for a long time, and you've just been saying, God, take it away. God, take it away. God, take it away. You've been pleading. You've been begging. You've been frustrated. Maybe you've even been angry with God because you have been pleading for so long and you've been wanting it to go away. And is it possible that whatever that is, Satan has been using it in your life to discourage you? To get you to doubt who God is. To get you at a place where maybe you don't even trust or believe him anymore. Maybe Satan's been doing that, but is it possible that God in his grace wants to use your weakness to develop you? to help you to see him in ways that you've never seen him before, to experience his grace, his power, and his strength in ways that you've never experienced it before. Okay, don't miss this. You see, Paul was able to embrace his weakness, and he was able to experience God's power by reframing his weakness as an asset rather than a liability. He reframes his weakness as an asset rather than a liability. Look at the end of verse 9 and what he says. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And there's the paradox. When I am weak, then I am strong. You see, Paul completely reframes the way we're to view weakness. He reframes even weaknesses that we feel deeply painful, and they can even appear to hinder our calling. You see, your weakness, not talking about sin, but your weakness, the circumstances of your life that have left you in a crippled situation where you feel like you can't go on anymore, the circumstances of your life is not a liability, but it's an asset. You see, God can use those things, not just to make a difference in this world, but to help you know him in ways that you've never known him before. You don't need to be afraid anymore of your weaknesses. You don't need to be embarrassed. You don't need to worry about what other people think. If anything, you should be afraid of the delusion of your strength. Because when you think you're strong, you don't need God anymore. When you think you're impressive, you're not impressed with God anymore. When you're trying to make a name for yourself, you're no longer living for the name of Jesus. You see, when you embrace your weakness, you actually tap into the endless resource of God's powers that are yours already in Jesus Christ. And for that reason, Paul says that he gladly boasts in his weaknesses. It is his weakness that helps him to know Jesus. It is his weakness that helps him find contentment in Jesus' power rather than his circumstances. A number of years ago, a good friend of mine taught me a prayer. And it's an awful prayer. It's a horrible prayer. And yet it's a beautiful prayer. It's a majestic prayer. I want to teach it to you. Here's what the prayer says. Lord, don't deliver me until you've developed me. Lord, don't deliver me until you developed me. You see how awful that is? God, I know that I'm in a situation, I'm in a circumstance right now that's painful, that's hard, that's annoying, that's embarrassing. But God, don't deliver me from that until you've developed all you want to develop in me. God, don't deliver me because I want to know you better than I've ever known you before. God, don't deliver me because I want you to have the fullness and complete control of my life. I want to see how beautiful you are. I want to see how powerful you are. I want to see how majestic you are. And I don't want to waste this experience because of discomfort. I want to see this experience used so that I can know you and your power and your grace. Lord, don't deliver me until you've developed me. And maybe today that's a prayer for you. Maybe today that God is actually inviting you into that prayer because whatever's happening in your life, he wants you to come to him and say, I need you. I desperately need you, God. I can't do it without you. Lord, don't deliver me until you've developed me. As we close out our time here today, I want to pray a prayer over you that the Apostle Paul prayed over the church in Ephesus from Ephesians chapter 3. So would you allow me, just in this moment as we close out, would you allow me to pray this over you as we learn to embrace our weaknesses so that we can experience God's power? For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be glory in the church and Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.